And for our last segment, we want to welcome Mr. Marvin Hurst, anchor and reporter for KENS 5, who will be the moderator of our Political Power segment with special guest Dr. Gregory Hudspeth, president of the NAACP San Antonio branch, and Representative Barbara Gervin-Hawkins, serving the Texas's 120th House District, who will talk to all of us about voter registration, the census, and some legislative items we are going to want to pay attention to for this next legislative session. Thank you so much, Mr. Hurst.
Thank you so much, Sydney, and welcome BCU to the SWAC and FAMU as well. Looking forward to that. So I get the opportunity to tell you about your personal power, that power to change things and not just sit back and complain. You have the power to cast a vote to change things. And a lot of people are talking about how critical this election is. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about something that happened yesterday that represented a moment in history that none of us will ever forget. You know, when it comes around to remembering Dr. King's birthday in January, we always remember that speech at that time. And I want to talk to Dr. Gregory Hudspeth, who is, he was born into an NAACP family. He was born to lead, I believe. He is an associate professor of political science at St. Philip's College. So, Dr. Hudspeth, do you remember that day? Do you remember that day when that speech was given?
I do, but just one very brief correction, and that is I am now a retired associate professor at St. Philip's College.
I'm trying to keep you in the game. I'm so sorry.
Well, actually, the NAACP has now become my full-time occupation. And so I spend a great deal of time working with the association. The time that King gave that speech in 1963, I was a high school student at that time, and I do remember the speech. My family was very active with the NAACP at that time, and so it's I guess one could say that it's in my DNA with regards to my activities with the association.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember the buzz at that time about the speech? I know we have social media and every network possible now, and blogs and so on to inform us about that. But was there a community buzz about what was going to happen in Washington?
I don't have that sort of recollection. What I do have from a historical perspective is that the March on Washington was actually pulled together by A. Philip Randolph. And Martin Luther King was simply one of the speakers. He was not necessarily the star at that time. However, his speech has, and so, there were other speakers that were there. Obviously, you had John Lewis there as a speaker, and you had Whitney Young there as a speaker. And so there were 6 of them, as a matter of fact, that came together, that formed that organization, formed that group, and they were known as the Big Six. Martin Luther King's speech, however, was so outstanding that is what we actually remember. You don't remember the activities of the other individuals, the speeches that were given by the other individuals there. The recollection is that of Martin Luther King, and it's because he was such a dynamic speaker.
So fast forward to 2020, we know the issues that they were facing then. As the person who leads the local NAACP, have the issues changed at all? Are we still facing the same kind of problems?
The 2020 March on Washington dealt with the same issues they dealt with in 1963. I looked here and I stated that one of the things that they were attempting to do in 1963 is that they were looking to bring, and let me emphasize this. I understand this, my academic training, I'm a political scientist by training with research interest in public policy. And so you look at the march in 1963, it was organized by A. Philip Randolph. And so A. Philip Randolph was a union person. And so the primary goal in looking at it at that time was looking at unequal treatment in employment issues, but primarily employment. In order to make that particular march significant, A. Philip Randolph decided to bring other groups into the organization with him. So he brought in the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He brought in the Urban League and very organizations in order to make it meaningful. Now, having said that, those issues that we're looking at today are those same issues. They were looking at unequal voting rights. We're still looking at unequal voting rights. They were looking at voter suppression. We're still looking at voter suppression. And points that they were attempting to make in 1968 are the same points that we're making today. So we can talk about this being 50 years later, but it's really the same story. We have not gotten there yet. Now, I keep hearing folks say that, well, this election is the most important election that we've had. I would suggest Americans, every election is the most important election until the next election. And that is that we have to understand that one of the things we need to do is that it's very good to have protests, but we need to have from protests to the ballot box, and then from the ballot box to the policy changes. And the only way you get those policy changes is making sure that the right people are in office. When you have someone who is in office that can suggest that there are Ku Klux Klansmen and Nazis that are very good people, and let me take some point out, we are nonpartisan. The NAACP is nonpartisan. But when you have someone in the White House suggesting that there are and good Ku Klux Klansmen, we have a major problem. And when you have the same person suggesting that he's done more for African Americans than any other president, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln, we have a problem because he's tone deaf and simply does not understand where we are and what our needs are. Now, but it was simply a statement of fact.
So I heard so many outcries for justice yesterday, especially as it applies to African American men who are being killed by an officer-involved shootings. Cases that a lot of them are still unresolved. How do we carry that energy, the emotion from the march and make it to the poll? Because sometimes that apathy becomes a whole wall for us. I mean, we talk about it, but how do we be about it, as they say?
Yeah. You cannot be involved in a moment, involved in a cause. And what I'm suggesting is that if we become active only because something has happened, then as soon as that dies down, we're back to the same old thing. So what you must do is that you must get involved and stay involved in those activities that have to do with the NAACP. The NAACP, we're primarily concerned about policy changes. That's our goal. Now, do we engage in those others? Sure, absolutely. We're going to try our best to get people to the polls on election day and get individuals to vote. We're going to support the protests that will take place. But at the end of the day, our primary goal is to make sure we don't need to fight the same fight over and over and over again. But that's where we are, regrettably.
And I think that's a misconception of the NAACP. Everybody still sees you as the action group with the sit-ins and the historical pictures of you. And the organization has evolved in what it does. Should we become members of that, or what should we do? Who should we join?
Absolutely. One of the things, if you look at the March on Washington in 1968, you will 63. I'm sorry, I misspoke. That there were several organizations that were there. You had the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, you had SNCC, you had the NAACP. What I would suggest to you is that not one organization is going to be able to meet the needs of everyone. What we want to do, though, is that you have to oriented. And so the NAACP is It's an organization that wants us to move from protest to policy. Now, we're not suggesting we're not going to engage in protests. I walked on picket lines around Handy Andy. I walked on picket lines around Joskis and Chetsis. I walked on. We will still continue to do that. But at the end of the day, our goal is to use that to raise attention, but then to find a policy solution at the end.
Okay, so you've given us our motion. What should be the message?
The message is there's no election that we should sit out. We've sat out on some elections. We should never sit out on an election. There's no issue concerning Black people in which we'll suggest that that's not an issue that's important enough for us to be actively involved. We should also look at to other folks of color and ensure that we're meeting their needs as well. When you have our government deciding to take babies away from their parents at the border, that should be a concern for all of us, not just those of us who of our brown brothers and sisters. That should be a concern because listen, doing the same thing to us. They took the babies away from their mothers. And so when we see this happening at our border, it's reminiscent of what happened to us as Black people when we were slaves. So those are the things we need to look. And when you have an Anglo male to shoot people in Wisconsin, and then after shooting, walk right past the police, and the police did not stop it. That should be a concern to all of us. And so those are the things that we need to watch. And if there are some policy issues that are involved, we need to ensure that we're there trying to change those policies as well.
That was a very striking image to me as well, watching him walk past those trucks, those lights, and they just asked, is anybody hurt? And he kept going. That is a fact of observation.
When you had the police officer to grab the gentleman, Blake, and pull him back by the back of his shirt, and then fire 7 bullets into his back. In order to do that, he had to dehumanize that person. Blake was no longer a person; he was an object, and that so there are bad police officers on the streets, and I'll ensure that we get those bad police officers off the street. And sometimes, regrettably, here in San Antonio, we are the worst at it because what we do is that the police chief will fire bad police officers, and in a few weeks they're back on the streets again through arbitration. And so we have some work to do here in San Antonio.
So we've got 2 huge pieces of the voting block here. We've got HBCUs and we've got a Panhellenic Council of people. That to me represents a lot of power. This, of course, is could be a starting point for some people. What advice would you give them?
I would want each presented here today to join the NAACP and join us in our march for equality and equal justice. And we may do it in different ways. I will suggest I'm affiliated with several organizations that are represented here today, if you will. I'm a proud Phi Alpha fraternity, initiated into Delta chapter at Houston-Tillotson College. So then I say Houston-Tillotson College, that means then that I attended an HBCU. For over 40 years, I was a faculty member and an administrator at St. Philip's College. And so I was employed in the U. So we use all of these organizations, our fraternal organizations, we use our HBCUs, and we use our organizations like the NAACP in order to help bring about a change. But we do it together. And one of the points I would like to make is that with the NAACP, we're not concerned for it. What we're concerned about is the results at the end of the day. The NAACP does not have to get the credit. We're not concerned about the credit. We're concerned about the results. And when you have we had a African American male that was shot by and killed by the sheriff's department. We will investigate that. We're in the process of investigating that to ensure that that individual was not shot because he was African American. There are some challenges in our jail system. So we want to create a policy, we'll bring about some policy changes so that in our jail system and in our arrest process of arresting people, we do it in a way in which is not racially based. You had an African American male that was jogging the other day, and he was stopped by the police. And after being stopped by the police, he was then arrested and is now in jail. What we want to do is ensure that African Americans know when the police, how do you respond to that? We don't need more African Americans in jail, but at the same time, we don't need more African Americans with their rights being denied on the streets, either by the San Antonio Police Department or by the Bexar County Sheriff's Office. And so we have a meeting set up with the police chief in a few days. I just finished a meeting with the sheriff a few days ago. That's how we're going to bring about the change.
Okay, Dr. Gregory Hudspeth, thank you for the work that you are doing and the NAACP is doing in the San Antonio community. We wish you well. Let's transition over now to Barbara Gervin-Hawkins. You've got to know her if you live in San Antonio. If you don't, I know where you've been. She represents the 120th, and that includes parts of San Antonio, Converse, Windcrest, and Kirby. She's a businesswoman, been out in the community working forever, it seems like, but I think her bio says 1981. I just feel like it's a little longer than that. Welcome to the forum this morning, Representative Hawkins. Let's talk about, first of all, let's find out what at the top of your mind after listening at what we've been talking about. What do you want to say? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
What comes to mind is the very first thing is that politics is the game changer. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation, because if we think historically, what has been our gap? We've marched, we did the lie-ins, the die-ins, we've talked to people, we've cried, we've done all of those things. We've got to engage more politically. That's where the rubber meets the road. And so having this conversation today, I want to be able to share the value of our groups being engaged and using their right to vote and what that can lead to. So, I'm here today to speak on that issue and how we get prepared.
How do we get prepared? I know we have to go out to the polls, whether it doesn't matter whose side you're on here, but to make that change, it begins at the poll. How do we get in the game and make change?
First of all, the message has to be helping everybody understand the value of their vote, okay? And why that vote is so important. If we think historically, if people was willing to kill you to vote and put every roadblock in the way to stop you from voting, that alone should stop those people from saying, my vote don't count. It counts immensely. So in preparing people, number one, we've got to make sure folks are registered to vote. Now, to vote this November, you have to be registered by October 5th. So, and you can check your registration. So go to Bexar County Elections, and there is the outline of how you make sure that you are currently registered. You need to make sure your name match and your address matches. And if they don't, you've got time to fix it. That's number one. We've also got to look at the fact that since suppression is going on, we must confirm our status. So let's do that. Let's make sure we confirm our status. Also, as we look at creating an environment that we don't have to stand in lines, vote early. San Antonio is going to have super polls around the county. So vote early, get it taken care of, because there will be a long ballot. And my colleagues across the aisle last session voted to eliminate straight ticket voting. because they believe that Democratic voters are lazy and won't go down the ballot. So let's make sure not only we just vote in the presidential election, but we go down the entire ballot and make sure we get folks that have our same values in office. If you're a felon, let's make sure that you're eligible to vote, because there's a lot of conversation and myths going on, and you can vote once you've completed all of your requirements for probation and parole. You are eligible to vote. And so in our preparation, let's make sure we meet our deadlines. Let's make sure we check our registration. Let's make sure that we ensure that we're ready on day one. Here's another thing I want to add, Marvin, is this. Voting by mail can happen. So quickly, every state establishes their own criteria. So the state of Texas have determined, we used to mail in ballots. You're automatic if you're over 65 years of age. But in times of the pandemic, what's being allowed now is if you have other issues, asthma, diabetes, or you think you're vulnerable, you can check that disability box. So you may be 18 or 19, but yet you have asthma, and being exposed could potentially create harm to you. Check that disability box. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to do anything. Once you check it, sign it, you're certifying that you have other conditions that could be adversely impacted. The more people that do the mail-in ballots, it keeps the pressure off the polls. And so when you do your mail-in ballot, you have to also make sure your signature matches so that ballot doesn't get kicked out. So you've got to check your registration, Marvin. That's important.
There is, and I'm not picking political sides here. There is some information, I will call it, that is going out that the mail-in ballots will be worthless. They are just, they'll never be counted, that kind of thing. The myths.
They are myths. They are myths. When you think about mail-in ballots, some states do mainly mail-in ballots. I was able to tour in California their mail-in ballot system. Think about the mail-in ballots. When you do a mail-in ballot, you have one name, one birth date, and most likely it's not a duplicate, okay? So your mail-in ballots in many cases are more secure because they will scan all of your details and match it up with that ballot, and you send it in. The conversations around it won't count is related to the mailbox. So you don't have to even put it in the mailbox. You can take it to the elections office itself, or you can also verify and call and make sure your ballot has been received.
Okay. And as you mentioned, there are going to be some super centers put up by the county. They are going to do mail-in ballots. I believe I heard in the county commissioners meetings, automatically going out to people 65 and older, but they're going to pay for postage both ways. So that's good. Is there anything legislatively that we should be keeping our eyes on right now?
Definitely. So I am the second vice chair of the Texas Legislative Black Caucus. And we had a press conference about 2 weeks ago. And as it relates to law enforcement, we're putting forward the George Floyd Act, authored by Sophronia Thompson, Representative Sophronia Thompson. So the George Floyd Act is one. Bowles Law, which is put forward by Representative Carl Sherman, and then myself and others, Equity and Justice Act of 2020. Also, we're looking at how we can enhance education. Education will never be the same again. What I want to share is that as of today and moving forward, education will never be the same. But here's what's happening, and this is what I'm concerned about in the African American community. Across the state of Texas, including in San Antonio, there's 20 to 25% of school-age kids that have not checked in any school. Think about it. 20 to 25% of school-age kids have not been found by the districts, okay? It adversely impacts us in the sense that if you don't have a family that promotes education, people don't have time for that. If you don't have the technology to connect to classrooms, my concern, Marvin, if we're not on top of this and create a community learning centers, we're going to have the academic slide that's going to hurt us for generations to come. Can you imagine if a large portion of our young people are not going to school at all, which means they're not even learning the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s? That has to be concerning to us. The academic slide occurs when you have breaks in education and you don't retain information. What about if you're a 4th grader and now you're supposed to be a 5th grader, but you're nowhere to be found? What happens when you're a 6th grader? So I'm immensely concerned about that. So we're looking at some educational initiatives that need to be filed so that we can create some community-based learning centers. The other thing we're going to be talking about is health. The area of health and the morbidity rate for African-American women in terms of dying in childbirth is unacceptable in a day of modernized medicine. The other big issue will be climate control. It is expected already, the Lieutenant Governor has said, this will be probably one of the longest sessions in history. So to give folks a little background, as a Texas legislator, we meet 140 days. That's the second Tuesday in January to the end of May. Then, if we haven't addressed all of our issues, the governor has the right to call a special session. It only can last 30 days. So what the lieutenant governor has put forth is if we end in May, he's going to call special sessions every month through September so we can complete our agenda. Now, we're hopeful that the majority of the House will flip. We're a red state. If we become purple, and if the House of Representatives become Democratic, and even if the Senate stays Republican, it gives us much more power. But to get our legislation, as Dr. Hudspeth said, everything's policy. We've got to get down to policy.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Representative Barbara Gervin-Hawkins, for giving us a wealth of information. Thank you again, Dr. Gregory Hudspeth with the NAACP, a wealth of information this morning. And thank you for making time for us this morning. I'm going to hand it back over to Sydney Knowles of Bethune-Cookman College, Zeta Phi Beta.
Marvin, before you go, Marvin, can we talk a little bit about the census? We've got to deal with the census.
We got to get the census because we got to get our money, right?
Right. Not only money, census. Now, census is considered the most reliable population count. So census also impact how many representatives you get. In San Antonio now, if we're counted properly, can get 2 more congressional seats. That means we potentially can have an African-American congressperson from San Antonio. So census is about money and also about your congressional seats because of our growth in population. So it's an easy process. It's 10 short questions, and we need everybody to complete their census. Go ahead, Doctor.
Yes, let me point out also the legislature's responsible for redrawing those district lines. And so if we do not flip that legislature, even if we pick up additional seats, they can exclude us as they have done in many cases. And so we really need to ensure that we're voting down. But the presidential election is extremely important. But the state legislative races this year are just as important as the presidential election.
No doubt about it, because I'll tell y'all, the games will continue to play if we don't do what we need to do. And also, we've got to realize that politics is the game changer. It's the game changer, y'all.
Okay. Thank you both again for sharing that information with us. Sydney, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Hurst, Representative Gervin-Hawkins, and Dr. Hudspeth. That political power segment was rich. Thank you so much for educating us and making sure that we are inspired and obligated to pay attention to what is going on around us in regards to how our legislation needs to change. and affect our communities in a more impactful way. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our presentation is coming to a close. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We hope that you enjoyed, we enjoyed, and we know that as soon as this ends, you're going to click that registration link. Again, it is on our Facebook channel right now in our chat, also on our YouTube and on our San Antonio National Panhellenic Council website as well. So before we end, I do want to bring back our event chairs, Sister Ornetta Hall and Sister Jovita Chandler, so that they can give us our final farewell and special acknowledgments for our sponsors.
Well, I just want to bring back all the committee members and our president. They're working so hard behind the scenes. Just to tell everybody, thank you so much for working hard to put this together. I want to thank our special guests for participating in our event today. I want to thank our sponsors, Obella Anesthesia, I Am Embrace Education, and Alpha One Greek. Don't forget, if you register today for the Run Challenge, you will be entered into a special prize drawing for a gift. So you'll have to complete your registration before 11:59 p.m. today. Jovita, do you have anything else you want to add, our race director?
All right, thank you. The registration link for the race is posted on our Facebook page, and also you can look at that on YouTube. I just ask that you share this information with your family and friends. Again, even if you did not attend an HBCU, you can always support the cause. So thank you. And Sister Ornetta, do you have a message you want to share with all of our attendees on today?
I don't know who I'm registering with, right? Southern University.
We can have another trash talking session. That's fine.
So the last question will be, will you accept the challenge?
And I woke up like this, proud to be a part of something outstanding. Them land grants from state to Claflin, educating black since 1896. I'm representing the Gardner and Blue, and know they can't shut us down because we way too historic. I'm proud of my my school. Shout out to the home team. We are open for success. We are destined to succeed. I am reppin' SC. Watch how we rejuvenate. Them Q's about to set it up. Look out for that Alpha train. Live from the plaza. It's the Marching 101. Schooling bands across the land with that Carolina funk. I'm glad I went to college. I ain't even gonna front. Shout out Morehouse. Shout out Morris Brown. Turn it up. I got that school spirit. I don't know about you, but I love my HBCU. SCSU. I love my HBCU. Delaware State. I love